The river took Tam under with a sound like the world snapping its teeth shut, and Oliver Graves screamed the boy's name until his throat tore raw. He had been 40 paces upstream, gathering willow bark along the bank where the water ran slow and green, when he heard the splash and the thin, panicked cry cut short. By the time he crested the rise above the Widow's Rapids, all he could see was a small dark head bobbing once twice between the standing white teeth of the current, and then nothing at all. Tam. His boots skidded on wet stone. He was already wading in before his mind caught up to what his body meant to do, the cold shocking the air from his lungs, the current dragging at his knees like 100 grasping hands. He was not a strong swimmer. He had never claimed to be. He was an apothecary, a stitcher of wounds, a man who spent his days grinding herbs into paste and his nights boiling water for fevered fishermen, not a man built for rapids that had drowned grown men twice his size. He might have drowned trying anyway if not for the roar behind him. "Move, boy healer." Durgash Steeljaw came off the bank like something loosed from a bow, a blur of green-gray skin and dark leather. And she did not wade, she dove, clean and flat, arms out ahead of her, straight into the worst of the churn where the rocks broke the water into foam. Oliver stumbled backward out of her path more from instinct than sense, and stood there in the shallows with the cold water lapping at his thighs, watching her vanish beneath the surface exactly where the current was fiercest, exactly where no sane creature would go. "No," the word tore out of him before he could stop it. "Durgash, no, you reckless." The rapids swallowed her answer if she gave one. Seconds stretched into something with no proper length at all. Oliver stood frozen, his heart slamming against his ribs so hard it hurt, watching the white water for any sign of her, of Tam, of anything. He thought of the boy's father, drowned 2 winters past in this same lake. He thought of Tam's small hands, always stained with fish scales, always reaching up to tug at Oliver's sleeve when he wanted to show off a catch. He thought with a clarity that frightened him that he could not survive losing either of them, and that thought alone told him something about himself he had not been ready to know. Then, 40 feet downstream, where the rapids finally gentled into a long, slow bend, the water broke apart and Durgash surfaced with a gasp like a landed whale. One massive arm locked across Tam's chest, hauling him up against her so his face broke the surface first. She kicked hard for the bank, cutting across the current at an angle that spoke of a strength Oliver had never seen in any creature, human or otherwise, and dragged herself and the boy up onto the mud and reeds in one motion, as though the river itself had simply given up trying to keep her. Oliver was already running. He hit his knees beside them, hands flying to Tam's face, to his throat, to the horrible stillness of his small chest. "Tam, Tam, look at me." No breath, no pulse he could find beneath his shaking fingers. He turned the boy onto his side and struck his back once, twice, the way old Nan Pell had taught him for drowned men pulled from the lake, and on the third strike Tam convulsed and vomited a lungful of lake water onto the mud and began, blessedly, to cough and wail. "There," Oliver breathed, gathering the boy up against his chest, feeling the small body shudder with sobs and cold. "There, you're here, I've got you." It was only then, with Tam clinging wet and shivering to his shirt, that Oliver looked up and found Durgash Steeljaw kneeling in the mud across from him, soaked through, her dark hair plastered flat against her skull, her chest heaving, watching him with an expression he could not name. "He is alive," she said. It was not a question. "He's alive," Oliver's voice cracked. "Because of you. Because I did not stand on the bank wringing my hands like an old woman." The words should have stung less than they did, given what she had just done, given that his own legs had carried him no farther than the shallows before hers had carried her into the heart of the danger itself. But the fear that had gripped his chest while she was under the water had not fully released him yet, and it came out of him sideways as anger. "You could have died," he snapped, hauling himself and Tam up onto shaking legs. "You went into the worst of that current without a rope, without a plan, without so much as a breath to spare, and if you had struck your skull on one of those rocks, then I would have struck my skull on a rock." Durgash rose too, water sluicing off her shoulders, off the fitted leather of her travel leathers that clung dark and heavy to every hard line of her, and there was no fear in her voice at all, only a kind of contempt for the very idea. The boy did not have time for a plan, Healer. He had time for someone to move. That's reckless. That's Oliver stopped because Tam had gone quiet against his chest, and he became abruptly aware of how loud his own voice had grown, how it must sound to a child who had nearly drowned not 5 minutes past. He forced himself to breathe. That was reckless, he said again, quieter now, though no less true. You don't know that river. You could have been swept into the lower falls. I know rivers better than I know men, she said, and there was something dangerous and amused in the way her yellow eyes caught the light. And I have yet to meet a man worth drowning for. The boy, however. She looked down at Tam, and something in her hard face softened, just barely, just enough for Oliver to see it before she hid it away again. The boy was worth the risk. Tam lifted his head from Oliver's shoulder, teeth chattering, and looked up at the huge orc woman kneeling, dripping in the mud beside him with the frank, unguarded awe that only children seemed able to manage. You went in the rapids, he said. Nobody goes in the rapids. I did. You're not scared of anything. Durgash Steeljaw's mouth curved, not quite a smile, but close to one. I am scared of very little small fish. Now hold still. She reached out and, with surprising gentleness for hands that could have crushed stone, wrung the worst of the water from the sleeve of his shirt. Your healer will fuss over you enough as it is. No need to catch a chill on top of it. Oliver Graves stood there in the mud, soaked to the waist, his heart still hammering, watching this woman the whole village still eyed with open suspicion tend to Tam with a tenderness she had shown no one else since she'd arrived at Larkmoor 3 weeks before, and felt something in his chest shift sideways, like a stone rolling loose from a wall he had not known was crumbling. He did not have the words for it yet. He only knew that when she had gone under the water, some part of him had gone under with her, and had not fully come back up since. To understand how Durgash Steeljaw came to be kneeling in the mud of the Widow's Rapids with a half-drowned fishing boy in her arms, one had to go back 3 weeks, to the night she walked into Larkmoor bleeding from a spear wound in her side, and asked no one's permission to sit down. Larkmoor was not a large village. It clung to the eastern shore of Lake Sarin the way moss clings to stone, a huddle of timber cottages and wooden docks where the fishing boats came in each dusk heavy with silver-bellied trout, where the smoke of smokehouses hung low over the water in the cold months, and where nothing much happened from one season to the next save the slow turning of the wheel of work and weather. Oliver Graves had lived there the whole of his 29 years, had inherited his father's shop and his father's calling both, and had spent a decade with his hands and other men's wound-setting bones broken on the docks, lancing infections, stitching the gashes fishermen brought back from bad falls on wet planking. He had learned in that decade that most men wanted comfort more than truth, and that he was better suited to giving them truth. It had not made him popular. It had made him necessary, which in a village like Larkmoor amounted to nearly the same thing. He had been closing his shop for the night when Constable Enna Wick banged on his door and told him there was an orc bleeding out on the dock, and did he want to let her die there or not. He had gone, because that was what he did, and because he had never in his life been able to walk past a wound he could close. She had been enormous, even folded against a post with her hand pressed to her side, taller than any man in the village, her green-gray skin pale with blood lost beneath a coating of road dust, her dark hair matted with sweat, and when he had knelt to examine the wound she had grabbed his wrist in a grip that could have shattered it and said, in a voice thick with pain but utterly without pleading, "If you mean to poison me, healer, know that I will break your neck before I die of it." "I don't poison my patients," he had said, as calmly as he could manage with half the village watching from a safe distance with pitchforks and one very old, very useless musket. "I'd have a very short career if I did." She had studied him for a long moment with eyes the color of amber held up to firelight, and then, slowly, released his wrist. "Then close the wound, human, and be quick about it, I do not enjoy your gawking neighbors." He had worked by lantern light on the dock, while half the village debated in low, ugly whispers whether they ought to simply let the orc bleed out and be done with it. And Constable Wick had stood over him with her hand on her sword the entire time, and Durgesh Steeljaw had not made a single sound through the whole of the stitching, though he knew from the white line of her jaw that it hurt her plenty. When he was done, he had sat back on his heels and told her honestly that she needed a week's rest if she did not want the wound to open again, and she had looked at him as though he had suggested she grow wings. "I do not have a week," she had said. "I do not have a place to spend it." It was Reeve Holly's Bion, Larkmore's balding, perpetually harried elder, who had made her the offer the following morning, more out of desperation than kindness. Larkmore's supply route to Ashford, crossing the nearest trading post large enough to sell grain, salt, and medicine in the quantities. A lake village needed to survive a hard winter, ran 40 miles through the Hollow Vale, a stretch of broken country that had swallowed 2 supply caravans and killed 3 good men in as many months to raiders who called themselves the Rustwater Band. No guard the village could hire wanted the work anymore. An orc warrior, wounded but clearly formidable, appearing out of nowhere with nowhere else to be, had seemed to Holly's Bion like the answer to a prayer he had been too proud to say aloud. "Guard our wagons to Ashford and back safe," he had told her, standing well clear of her reach, "and we will pay you in coin and give you provisions and a roof for as long as you need one. That is the whole of the bargain." Durgesh Steeljaw had looked at him for a long moment, and then at Oliver Graves, who stood nearby with his medicine satchel still in hand, and something had passed behind her eyes that Oliver would not understand until much later. "I have no love for humans," she had said plainly to the whole gathered crowd of them. "I have no love for orcs either of late, if you must know all of it, but I keep my bargains. Give me your terms in writing, and I will guard your wagons better than any 3 men you could hire." It was, Oliver would come to learn, the truest thing she had ever said to any of them, and the beginning of everything. She had taken a room above the smithy, the only building in Larkmore whose owner did not much care what the rest of the village thought of him, and for those first weeks she had kept to herself, training alone on the shingle beach at dawn with a curved falchion that looked like it had seen 100 battles, drawing stares wherever she walked, answering none of them. Oliver saw her most days, changing the dressing on her wound, and it was in those visits, brief, businesslike, conducted with her scowling at the ceiling while he worked, that he had first begun to notice things about her that had nothing to do with medicine at all. The way her amber eyes tracked every movement in a room without seeming to. The low, rough music of her voice when she wasn't guarding it. The fact that beneath all that leather and muscle and barely checked violence, she moved through Larkmore's streets like a woman bracing herself against a blow that never quite landed, but that she expected at every turn. He understood that bracing better than he let on. He had grown up hearing his own father's stories of the border wars, had grown up in a village that had buried its share of sons to orc raiding parties 2 generations back, and he knew as well as anyone how deep that old fear ran in Larkmore's bones. He had also learned, stitching men's wounds for a decade, that fear made poor company for judgment, and that the two were far too often mistaken for each other. It was on her 5th visit to his shop, with her wound nearly healed and her patience for his fussing worn thin, that she had first truly looked at him, not as the village healer, not as an obstacle or a convenience, but as a man, and something had crackled between them that neither had expected. "You watch me," she had said without preamble as he wound a fresh bandage around her ribs. "Not the way the others watch me, not with fear. I watch everyone," he had said. "It's a poor habit for a man who's meant to notice when a wound's gone bad. That is not what I meant, healer." He had looked up then and found her amber eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that made his hands go still against her skin. This close, he could see the fine scars along her jaw, could smell rain and iron and something warmer underneath, could feel the heat of her skin through his fingertips. He had swallowed and made himself finish the bandage, though his hands were not quite steady. "I know what you meant," he had said quietly. "I don't have a good answer for it. I did not ask for one." But she had not looked away, and neither had he, and the silence between them had stretched long and taut as a bowstring before she finally broke it with a low, rough laugh that seemed aimed as much at herself as at him. "You are a strange little man, Oliver Graves. I've been told. Most men in this village will not meet my eyes at all. Most men in this village," he had said, with more boldness than he felt, "have never had to explain to a corpse's widow why her husband bled to death because I hesitated. I don't have room left in me for being afraid of things that haven't hurt me yet." Something had shifted in her face at that, not softened. Exactly, she was not a woman who softened easily, but opened a fraction like a door left unlatched. "That," she had said, "is the first honest thing any human in this village has said to me since I arrived." It should not have felt like a victory. It had felt to Oliver like the beginning of one. The first true test of Larkmore's tolerance came 2 weeks later, on a night thick with lake fog, in the common room of the Netted Hook Tavern. Oliver had gone in for a bowl of stew after a long day of lancing an infected hand, and found Durgash Steele, already seated in the corner with her back to the wall, the way he had noticed she always sat, in any room, as if the whole world might come at her from any direction and she meant to see it coming. She had a mug of the tavern's watered ale in front of her, untouched, and half the room's eyes on her, and none of it seemed to trouble her at all until Garrick Thorne, the miller's eldest son, deep in his cups and deeper in old grudges, stood up from his own table and made his way toward hers. "You," Garrick said, jabbing a thick finger toward her, "shouldn't be drinking in a decent house. My uncle died at Redbrook Ford fighting your kind. You think you can just walk in here and sit like you belong." The room went quiet in the particular way rooms went quiet when they smelled a fight coming and weren't sure yet which way to lean. Durgash did not stand, though Oliver had seen her move fast enough to know she could have crossed the room before Garrick finished his sentence if she'd wanted to. "I am not responsible for what happened at Redbrook Ford," she said evenly. "I was a child when that battle was fought, if I was born at all. Doesn't matter. You're all the same underneath." Garrick. Oliver was on his feet before he'd fully decided to be, his stew forgotten. "That's enough." Garrick turned on him with the particular scorn drunk men reserve for men they've always considered smaller than themselves. "You'd defend her, after what her kind did to this whole lake." "I'd defend anyone from being baited into a fight they didn't start," Oliver said, keeping his voice level though his heart was pounding. "She's guarding our supply route because none of the rest of you would take the work. She's earned a bowl of ale in peace, same as anyone. She's an orc, Graves. She's a person sitting quietly in a corner, which is more than I can say for you right now." Garrick's face went a dark, ugly red, and for a moment Oliver thought the man might actually swing at him, drink stupid and full of old grief he didn't know how else to spend. But before it could go further, Durgash rose, not fast, not threatening, simply unfolding to her full considerable height with a slow deliberateness that made the whole room hold its breath and set a single silver coin on the table with a click that seemed to echo. "For the ale I did not finish," she said to the tavern keeper, and then to Garrick without heat, "I did not come here to fight grieving men over battles I had no part in. I came here to drink in peace, which I no longer have, so I will go." She looked then at Oliver, and something in her gaze made his chest tighten. "You did not need to speak for me, healer." "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She held his eyes a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then walked out into the fog without another word, and Oliver Graves found he could not finish his stew, because his whole body was still thrumming with the aftershock of having chosen a side, in public, in a room full of people who would remember it. He found her 20 minutes later down at the end of the long dock, sitting with her boots dangling over black water, the lake fog curling around her like something alive. He sat down beside her without asking, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. "You did not have to do that," she said finally. "You said that already. I am saying it again because I do not understand it. She turned her head to look at him, and in the moonlight her amber eyes seemed to glow faintly cat-like. "You have known me 3 weeks, Oliver Graves. I owe you nothing and you owe me nothing, and yet you stood between me and a man twice your size over a bowl of ale I had already decided to abandon. Maybe I didn't do it for the ale. Then for what?" He considered lying or deflecting, the way he had learned to do with most difficult questions in his life. But something about the fog and the quiet lake, and the way she was looking at him unguarded, for once, without the armor she wore even when she wasn't wearing armor at all, made him want to tell her the truth instead. "Because it wasn't fair," he said. "And because I've watched you these past weeks, training alone on that beach every dawn while the whole village pretends not to stare, eating alone in corners, sleeping above a smithy because no one would rent you a room facing the street. And I've thought more than once that a woman who dove into danger for strangers with no thought for herself deserved better than what this village has given her." He paused. "And because I like you, which is a foolish thing to admit to a woman who could break me in half, but there it is." Durgash Steelja was quiet for a long moment, the fog drifting between them, and when she finally spoke her voice had gone low and rough in a way he hadn't heard before. "Among my people," she said, "a warrior does not say such things lightly. To stand between another and danger without being asked, that is not a small thing, that is a claim. I didn't know that. I know you did not." Something like a smile pulled at the corner of her mouth. "It is, perhaps, fortunate for you that I do not hold humans to orc custom, or you would find yourself far more entangled with me than a bowl of stew would explain." Would that be so terrible? He hadn't meant to say it. It came out of him low and honest before caution could catch up, and he watched her go very still beside him, watched the fog curl between them like a held breath. "No," she said at last, quietly, as if the admission cost her something. "It would not." She reached out then, slow and deliberate, and laid her large hand over his where it rested on the dock boards, her skin warm despite the cold night air, her calluses rough against his palm. Neither of them said anything more. They sat there at the end of the dock until the fog burned away with the first gray light of dawn, her hand over his, the lake lapping quietly at the pilings below, and Oliver Graves understood, with a clarity that both terrified and steadied him, that he had already begun to fall for a woman the whole village feared, and that he did not want, even a little, to stop. The rapids happened 4 days after that. In the aftermath, Tam wrapped in blankets by Oliver's hearth, sipping hot broth, chattering about the rapids to anyone who would listen with the resilience only children seemed to possess. Larkmore's opinion of Durgash Steelja did not transform overnight. Old fears did not die so easily. But something had cracked, visibly, in the wall of suspicion the village had built around her, and Oliver watched it happen in small ways over the following days. A fisherman nodding to her on the dock where before he would have crossed to the other side. Nanpel leaving a basket of bread outside the smithy door with no note attached, though everyone knew whose hands had baked it. Children who were not Tam beginning shyly to wave. It was not everyone. Garrick Thorne still glared. A knot of older villagers still muttered when she passed, still locked their doors a little tighter at night. But it was a beginning, and Oliver held onto it the way a man holds onto the first warm day after a long winter, unsure if it will last but grateful for it regardless. That night, after Tam had finally fallen asleep by the fire and Oliver had checked his breathing twice more than was strictly necessary, he found Durgash sitting on the low stone wall outside his shop, still faintly damp from the river, watching the lake. "You should be resting," he said, coming to sit beside her. "I have swum in worse than that river, healer," but she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with her body. "The boy, is he well?" "He's sleeping. He'll have nightmares about it probably for a while yet." "But he's alive, and that's because of you." He hesitated. "I was cruel to you on the bank, calling you reckless when you just saved his life." "You were afraid," she said simply. "I have seen enough men in battle to know fear when it wears the mask of anger. I did not take it as cruelty. I meant it as truth, though. You didn't hesitate at all. You didn't even look for a rope or call for help or, there was no time for a rope. Her voice sharpened just slightly, the old warrior's edge surfacing. A child was drowning, Oliver Graves. I did not calculate the risk to myself, because the risk to myself was not the thing that mattered in that moment. Perhaps that is reckless by your reckoning. Among my people we call it something else. What do you call it? She looked at him then, and the moonlight caught the sharp planes of her face, the strong line of her jaw, the depth of amber in her eyes, and Oliver felt his breath catch the way it always did now when she looked at him like that, like he was the only other person in the world worth seeing. We call it choosing, she said. You choose what matters more than your own skin. I chose the boy. It was not a hard choice. It has rarely been a hard choice for me, choosing what matters. Her gaze did not waver from his. It has only ever been hard finding the thing worth choosing. And have you found it? His voice came out barely above a whisper. I am beginning to think I have found several things in this small, foolish, frightened village, she said. The boy, this lake which is more beautiful than I expected a human place to be. A pause, deliberate, waited. You. Oliver did not remember deciding to close the distance between them. He only remembered the moment his hand found the side of her face, rough with old scars and warm beneath his palm, and the moment her breath caught, and the moment she leaned into his touch instead of pulling away, and then his mouth was on hers and hers was on his, fierce and searching and hungrier than he had known he could be. Her hands fisting in the front of his shirt to drag him closer, as though she meant to make up for 3 weeks of careful distance in a single kiss. She tasted of lake water and wood smoke, and she kissed like she did everything else without hesitation, without half measures, as if she had already decided, long before he had worked up the courage to touch her, exactly what she wanted. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, she rested her forehead against his, her hands still fisted in his shirt, and said, low and rough, I do not do things by half, Oliver Graves. If you mean to kiss me, know that I will not let you go easily after. Good, he said, and kissed her again, and felt her smile against his mouth. They did not speak of it in the village square. That would come later, when they had no choice left but to speak of it in front of everyone. For now, it was theirs alone, stolen hours at the end of the dock, in the shadow of the smithy, in the quiet hour before dawn when the fishermen had not yet risen, and the lake lay still and silver, and the whole world seemed to belong only to the two of them. But the world, as it always did, had other plans for how long that quiet could last. The Hollow Vale run came due at the first frost. Larkmoor's stores had run thinner than usual that autumn, a poor harvest upriver, a shortage of salt for the smokehouses, medicine stocks. Oliver had exhausted treating a fever that swept the eastern cottages in early October, and Reeve Byon called a village meeting to announce what everyone already dreaded hearing. The caravan to Ashford Crossing could not wait for spring. Without salt for the winter catch and medicine for the fevers that always followed the cold, Larkmoor would not survive the season intact. We need 6 wagons through the Vale and back within the fortnight, Byon said, standing on the meeting-house steps with the wind off the lake tugging at his cloak. The Rustwater band has grown bolder. I will not lie to any of you, the last caravan through lost 2 men and half its cargo, but we have no choice. We go or we starve. We have Durgesh Steeljo, someone called from the crowd. Nan Pell, Oliver noted with something like pride in his chest. She kept her bargain with the boy in the rapids. She'll keep it with the wagons too. Durgesh, standing near the back of the gathering with her arms crossed, said nothing. But Oliver saw her spine straighten at the words, saw something flicker across her face that might have been surprise, or might have been the particular ache of being trusted by people who had feared her only weeks before. I need a field surgeon on the wagons as well, Byon continued. Whoever guards the caravan, if there's trouble, will need someone who can stitch a wound on the road, not wait 2 days for the boy to be carried home to bleed out in his own bed. Oliver did not remember deciding to speak. He only remembered his own voice, steady and certain, cutting across the murmuring crowd. I'll go. Byon blinked at him. Graves, you're the only healer this village has. If something happens to you on that road, then Nan Pell knows enough of my craft to manage until I'm missed, Oliver said. But I've stitched every wound this village has carried home from that road for 10 years, Reeve. I'd rather stitch them where they're made than wait here wondering if the man dies before he reaches me. It was not entirely the whole truth of why he volunteered, and he suspected Durgesh knew it the moment her eyes found his across the gathered crowd. He was not going for the wagons, or even fully for the village. He was going because the thought of her walking into the hollow vale without him at her side, into a stretch of country that had already swallowed better armed men than the Rustwater raiders usually bothered killing, felt like a wound he could not stitch shut from a safe distance. Later, as they loaded medicine chests into the lead wagon by lantern light, she found a moment to speak to him alone. You did not need to volunteer, healer. Her voice was low, but there was an edge to it he recognized now as worry, though she would never have named it so plainly. The road to Ashford is not a rapids you can dive into and swim clear of. If the Rustwater band finds us, then you'll be glad of a man who can pull an arrow out clean and stitch the hole after, he said, setting the last chest into the wagon bed. I'm not asking your permission, Durgesh. I've made my choice. Something in her face shifted, frustration warring with something warmer, something that looked in the lantern light almost like fear for him, an emotion he was fairly certain she had not allowed herself to feel for another living creature in a very long time. If you die on that road, she said, low and fierce, I will not forgive you for it. Then I suppose I'd better not die, he said, and reached up to brush a strand of dark hair from her face and felt her lean just slightly into the touch. I'd rather not disappoint you, see that you do not. They left at dawn, 6 wagons heavy with the last of Larkmore's spare coin traded for salt, grain, and medicine, escorted by Durgesh Steeljaw astride a borrowed horse far too small for her frame, and Oliver Graves riding the lead wagon beside old Perrin Vance, who had driven the Ashford road for 30 years and had the white scar on his scalp to prove how dangerous it had become. The hollow vale unrolled around them for 2 days without incident. Broken hills scraped bare by old fires, stands of skeletal pine, the road cutting a pale scar through country that had once, Perrin told him, belonged to a dozen small farms before the border wars burned them out. Durgesh rode ahead of the column most of the time, scouting the ridgelines, and Oliver found himself watching her more than he watched the road, the easy, dangerous grace of her even on a horse too small for her, the way her eyes never stopped moving across the landscape, cataloging every shadow. They were 3 miles from Ashford Crossing, with the trading post smoke already visible on the horizon, when the Rustwater band struck. They came off the ridge on both sides at once, a dozen men on foot and horseback, bristling with crossbows and hooked spears, and the first bolt took the lead ox in the throat before Oliver had even fully registered the shout of warning. The wagon lurched, Perrin swore and hauled at the traces, and Oliver was thrown hard against the sideboard as chaos erupted around them. Durgesh. He didn't know why he screamed her name first before anything else, but it tore out of him raw and desperate as he scrambled for his satchel, for anything that might be a weapon, watching arrows and bolts fill the air. She was already moving. He had never seen her fight before, not truly, and the sight of it stole what little breath the fall had left him. She came off her horse in a single motion that ended with her falchion already drawn, cutting through the first raider's spear haft, and the arm that held it in the same stroke, wheeling to block a second man's downward swing with an economy of motion that spoke of a lifetime of war. She was not reckless here, he realized, watching her. She was precise, terrible, and utterly in control, a different creature entirely from the woman who kissed him at the end of the dock, and yet unmistakably still her. Get the boy driver down, she roared, meaning Perrin's young nephew in the second wagon, and Oliver was already moving, dragging the boy from the driver's seat as a bolt splintered the wood where his head had been a heartbeat before. The fight was short and vicious. Durgesh cut a path through 3 raiders before the rest broke and scattered back toward the ridgeline, unwilling to lose more men to a single orc warrior fighting like something out of an old war song. But not before a raider's spear caught Perrin Vance across the ribs, laying him open, and Oliver was on his knees in the road beside him before the old man had even finished falling. "Hold still," Oliver said, hands already moving, tearing cloth for a pressure bandage, his voice steadier than he felt. "Hold still, Perrin, I've got you. I've closed worse than this." "Feels considerably worse than that from where I'm lying, boy," Perrin managed, through gritted teeth, and Oliver almost laughed despite the blood soaking his hands, because it was such a purely Perrin thing to say, even half dying in a road. Durgesh was there a moment later, kneeling on Perrin's other side, her falchion still bloody in one hand, watching Oliver work with an intensity that had nothing to do with doubt in his skill, and everything to do with the fear he'd seen in her eyes the night before they left Larkmoor. "He will live?" she asked low. "He'll live if I can get this closed properly before we reach Ashford." Oliver's hands did not stop moving, needle and thread pulled from his satchel with the quick certainty of a decade's practice, working by instinct as much as sight. "Hold him still for me." She did, her large hands gentle on the old man's shoulders despite the blood on them, and Oliver worked in the cold autumn light with his heart still hammering from the fight, closing the wound with careful, even stitches while Perrin cursed steadily under his breath and Durgesh murmured something low and rhythmic that Oliver did not understand, but that seemed, somehow, to steady them all 3. When it was done, when Perrin was bandaged and propped against the wagon's sideboard with color slowly returning to his face, Oliver sat back on his heels, hands shaking now that the urgency had passed, and found Durgesh watching him with an expression he had never seen on her before, something raw and unguarded, stripped of all her usual fierce composure. "You did not flinch," she said, "even with the fighting all around you. You did not flinch once." "I don't have room to flinch when someone's bleeding in front of me." He wiped his hands on a clean rag, exhausted suddenly, bone-deep. "It's the only thing I've ever been good at, Durgesh, staying steady when everything else is chaos." "It is not the only thing you are good at." She reached out and cupped his jaw in one broad hand, tilting his face up to hers, and there was something fierce and possessive in her gaze that made his breath catch despite the exhaustion, despite the blood still drying on both their hands. "I watched you today. I have watched you for weeks, and I am done pretending I do not know what I want, Oliver Graves. What do you want?" "You," she said simply, without hesitation, the way she did everything. "All of you. Not as a healer to be thanked, not as a man to be protected from a distance. I want you at my side, and I want the whole world to know it, and I am tired of being careful about a thing that does not deserve carefulness." He kissed her then, in the middle of the Ashford road with Perrin bleeding gently against the wagon, and the scattered raiders' blood still dark on the packed earth. Kissed her like he meant to answer every word of that declaration with his whole body, and felt her arms come around him fierce and sure, holding him like something she had decided, once and for all, she would not let the world take from her. They reached Ashford Crossing by dusk, sold their cargo, bought what Larkmoor needed and more, and began the 2-day journey home with Perrin recovering steadily in the wagon bed, and something new and unshakable settled between Oliver Graves and Durgesh Steeljoe. No longer a question, no longer careful, simply true. They should have known the road home would be easier than the road they'd have to walk once they arrived. Larkmoor greeted the returning caravan with the relief of a village that had feared the worst and been spared it, until word spread, as word always spread in villages that size, of exactly how Perrin Vance had come to be wounded, and exactly who had fought off a dozen Rustwater raiders single-handed to save 6 wagons of desperately needed supplies, and exactly how the village healer had been seen kissing that same orc woman in the middle of the Ashford road in full view of 2 other men. The gossip took 3 days to curdle into something uglier. It began, as these things often did, with Garrick Thorne, still nursing his bruised pride from the tavern, and it found fertile ground in a handful of older villagers who had never fully let go of their fear. And it fed on a rumor started by someone Oliver never did identify with certainty, that the Rustwater band's attack had not been random at all, that Durgesh Steeljaw had somehow led them to the caravan, that no lone band of human raiders could have coordinated so precise a strike unless an orc had shown them the way. It was a lie built entirely out of fear and old grief, and it should have died the moment anyone thought clearly about it. She had bled for that caravan, had cut down 3 raiders to protect it, had carried Perrin Vance's weight against her own body for the last mile into Ashford when his strength gave out. But fear rarely waited for clear thinking, and by the 4th morning after their return, a crowd had gathered in Larkmoor Square, and Reeve Hawley's Bayan, caught between the truth he half believed and the fear he could not fully quiet, had sent word for Durgesh Steeljaw to come and answer for it. Oliver was in his shop when Tam came running, breathless, to tell him what was happening. He did not remember the walk to the square. He remembered only arriving to find Durgesh standing alone in the center of it, surrounded on all sides by a crowd that had grown ugly and loud. Garrick Thorne at its front with a torch in his hand, though the sun stood high overhead, and no purpose for that torch except the message it carried. "She led them to us." Garrick was shouting, and the crowd rumbled its agreement, fear feeding fear the way it always did in a mass of frightened people who had found, at last, something they could point at instead of the true shapelessness of their dread. "She's one of them. You think an orc guards human wagons out of the goodness of her heart. She was paid twice over, once by us, once by her own kind to lead them right to our salt and grain." "That is a lie," Durgesh said, and her voice, though steady, carried an undertone Oliver had never heard from her before. "Not fear of the mob. She did not fear men, but something else, something that looked almost like grief at how quickly the fragile trust of the past weeks had come apart. I bled for your wagons. I carried your man on my own back the last mile into Ashford. Ask Perrin Vance if you doubt me. Ask the healer who stitched him." "Ask the healer who's been sharing your bed, you mean," someone else called, and the crowd's ugly laughter cut through Oliver like a blade. He did not decide to move. His feet simply carried him forward through the crowd, past Bayan's half-raised hand, until he stood directly between Durgesh Steeljaw and Garrick Thorne's torch, his back to her, his eyes on the mob. "Enough," he said, and his voice, though it shook, carried across the square. "Enough, all of you. I stitched Perrin Vance's wound myself, 3 miles outside Ashford, after Durgesh Steeljaw cut down 3 raiders who nearly took his life and mine both. I watched her fight for every one of you with my own eyes. If any of you doubts that, you can ask Perrin yourselves. He's lying in his own bed not 2 streets from here, alive because of her, and none of you have thought to ask him a single question before lighting torches in the square." "Step aside, Graves," Garrick growled. "This isn't your fight." "It is entirely my fight." Oliver did not move. His heart was slamming against his ribs, every instinct screaming at him to be afraid, and beneath that fear something harder and more certain than he had ever felt in his life. "You want to burn something today, Garrick. You'll have to go through me first. And I promise you, I have stitched more wounds in this village than any of you have ever bled from, and I am done being quiet while good people are torn apart by fear that has nothing true underneath it." "She's an orc. She's the woman I love," Oliver said, and the square went utterly, shockingly silent, the words landing like a stone dropped into still water. "She dove into the widow's rapids without a second thought to save a drowning child. She bled in the hollow vale to save every family in this village from starving this winter. And if that is not enough to earn her a place among you, then I don't know what any of you think decency is for." Garrick's torch wavered, and for one terrible moment Oliver thought the man might swing it anyway, mob and momentum being what they were, fear rarely listening to reason once it had found its teeth. But then a new voice cut through the square, high and clear and utterly without doubt. "She saved me." Tam pushed through the crowd, small and fierce, planting himself beside Oliver with his chin jutted out in an expression Oliver recognized, with a jolt as identical to Durgash's own stubborn set of jaw. She jumped in the rapids and pulled me out when nobody else could have. She's not a raider. She's the reason I'm standing here at all. The silence that followed was different from the silence before, heavier, more uncertain, the crowd's righteous fury faltering against the plain, unbearable truth of a living child standing in front of them. Reeve Byon stepped forward then, finally finding whatever courage he'd been searching for, and raised his hands for quiet. Enough of this. I sent for Durgash Steele, though, to answer questions, not to be burned in my square without so much as a trial's worth of evidence. Garrick Thorne, put out that torch before I have you in the stocks for endangering this whole village with fire in a wooden square. He turned to the crowd. Anyone here who fought beside her, or was healed because of her, speak now, or hold your tongue about lies you cannot prove. It was Perrin Vance who answered, hobbling into the square on a borrowed cane with his ribs still bandaged beneath his shirt, his young nephew supporting his other arm. "I'll speak," he said, voice carrying despite its weakness. "I watched that orc woman cut down 3 Rustwater raiders to protect wagons that weren't even hers to protect. I felt her carry me the last mile into Ashford when I couldn't walk another step myself. If she'd wanted us dead, she'd have let those raiders finish the job instead of bleeding to stop them. Anyone who says different wasn't there, and hasn't earned the right to speak on it." The crowd's fury drained visibly, replaced by something more uncertain: shame in some faces, grudging reconsideration in others. Garrick Thorne lowered his torch at last, though his face remained set and unhappy, unwilling to fully surrender ground he'd claimed out of old grief more than present truth. Durgash had said nothing through all of it, standing utterly still behind Oliver, and when he finally turned to look at her, he found her watching him with an expression that undid something tightly wound in his chestnut triumph at the crowd's retreat, but something far more vulnerable, something that looked almost like disbelief that anyone, let alone a village that had feared her from the moment she arrived, might come to see her clearly at last. "You said it in front of all of them," she said quietly, when the crowd had begun slowly to disperse, Byon shouting orders to clear the square, "that you love me. I meant every word of it. You did not have to say it that way." In front of everyone, with Garrick's torch still burning. "I know." He reached for her hand and did not let go even with half the village still watching, still uncertain what to make of the sight. "I wanted them to hear it plainly, so there'd be no mistaking it later. I love you, Durgash Steeljaw. I'm not interested in loving you quietly, in shadows, in stolen hours at the end of a dock where no one can see. I want to love you where the whole world can see it, torches and all." Something in her fierce composure finally, fully broke, and she pulled him against her in the middle of the square, uncaring of who watched, and kissed him with a desperate, grateful intensity that spoke louder than any words could have of exactly how much his standing between her and that mob had meant. "Then let them see," she murmured against his mouth. "Let all of them see exactly what they nearly burned." But the true test of Larkmore's change of heart came not from words spoken in a square, but from what happened 3 nights later, when the Rustwater band, humiliated by their failed ambush and hungry for the wealth Larkmore's caravan had denied them, came for the village itself under cover of darkness. Oliver woke to the sound of the watch bell tolling wild and frantic, and Durgash was already at the window, falchion in hand, her whole body coiled with the particular stillness of a warrior assessing a threat before it fully arrived. "Raiders," she said, "on the eastern road coming fast, perhaps 15, perhaps more." "The village has no proper defenses," Oliver said, already reaching for his boots, his satchel every instinct screaming toward the wounds he knew were coming. "A dozen fishermen with pitchforks and 1 old musket won't hold against 15 armed raiders. They will not need to hold alone." Durgash was already moving toward the door, and there was something in her face grim, fierce, utterly certain, that told him she had already decided exactly what she meant to do about it. "I know this ground now. I know where a dozen men can be made to feel like 50, if the ground is chosen well." The battle for Larkmore, when it came, was not the grand clash of a war song, but something smaller and more desperate, and, in its way, more remarkable. A lake village's fishermen and farmers standing shoulder to shoulder with the very orc woman half of them had nearly burned in the square 3 nights before, because Durgesh Steeljaw had spent the hours before the raiders' arrival walking the eastern approach with Reeve Bayan, choosing the narrow lane between the smokehouses where a dozen men could hold a line against 15, showing old Perrin Vance's nephew and a dozen frightened villagers exactly where to stand and exactly when to strike. Oliver fought alongside them with no weapon but the knowledge in his hands, setting up a field station in the meeting house with Nan Pell, ready for the wounds he knew would come. And when the fighting reached its worst, when a raider broke through the line and came at the meeting house door with a hatchet raised, it was Tam who screamed the warning that let Oliver duck aside, and Durgesh who arrived a heartbeat later to cut the man down before he could strike a second time, blood-spattered and terrible and utterly. Completely, the reason Larkmore did not burn that night. By dawn, the Rustwater band that survived had fled back into the hollow vale, and Larkmore stood scorched in places but whole, and the village that gathered in the gray morning light to survey the damage looked at Durgesh Steeljaw exhausted, wounded across one forearm, still holding her bloodied falchion with an expression that had at last, fully and finally changed. It was Garrick Thorne, of all people, who broke the silence, standing at the edge of the crowd with his own wounded shoulder bound in a hasty bandage. "You held the eastern lane," he said, gruffly, unable quite to meet her eyes. "My own boy is alive because you told him where to stand. I said terrible things about you in this square. I won't say I was right to say them. It was not a grand apology. It was not even entirely forgiveness fully given. But it was true and honest, and Durgesh Steeljaw, who had spent her whole life among people who feared her first and questioned that fear never, seemed to understand exactly how much that small, grudging honesty cost the man, and nodded once in acceptance. "You fought well tonight, Miller's son," she said. "That is worth more to me than an apology." Reeve Holly's Bayan stepped forward then, into the gray morning light, and raised his voice for the whole gathered village to hear. "Larkmore owes Durgesh Steeljaw a debt that coin cannot repay," he said. "She has saved a drowning child, guarded our supply road with her own blood, and stood in the breach tonight when raiders came for everything we have. I will hear no more talk in this village of what she is, only what she has proven herself to be, again and again, since the night she first walked onto our dock bleeding and asked for nothing but a fair bargain. She has more than kept her end of it. It is past time we kept ours." The crowd's murmur this time held no fear in it at all, only something like shame, and something like gratitude, and slowly, one by one, villagers who had crossed the street to avoid her 3 weeks before came forward instead, offering rough thanks, offering hands to shake, offering, in the plain, unglamorous way of people who did not know how else to say it, the simple acknowledgement that they had been wrong and that they were glad, deeply glad, that she had chosen to stay among them regardless. Oliver found her hand amid the gathering crowd and laced his fingers through hers, uncaring of the blood and grime on both, and felt her grip tighten in answer, felt the tension of the whole long fight finally begin to ease out of her powerful frame. "They see you now," he said quietly. "All of them truly see you. They see what I have done," she said. "It is not the same as seeing what I am. But it is a beginning, and I did not think when I walked onto that dock bleeding 3 weeks ago that I would find even this much." She turned to look at him, and something fierce and tender moved across her face all at once. "I did not think I would find you either. Well." He managed a tired smile despite the ache in every muscle. "I did call you reckless the first time I truly saw what you were capable of, diving into those rapids without a second thought. And I told you," she said, "that some things are worth being reckless for." She lifted their joined hands and pressed a kiss to his knuckles, slow and deliberate, in full view of the whole recovering village. "You were worth it, Oliver Graves, from the very first night, though I did not yet have the words for it. You and the boy and this strange, stubborn, frightened little village that I have somehow, against every instinct I once had come to think of as my own. The formal reckoning of Larkmore's debt came a week later, once the last of the raid's damage had been repaired, and Perrin Vance's ribs had knit enough for him to stand unassisted, and it took the shape Oliver had least expected. A full village gathering in the square, the same square where a torch had once burned toward Durgash's face, now hung instead with lake flowers and strung lanterns for what Reeve Bayan called, with unusual ceremony, a debt of honor owed and paid. Durgash stood at the center of it in her fitted travel leathers, the same one she had worn since the night she first stumbled into Larkmore bleeding, cleaned now, mended where the raiders' blades had torn them, still snug and formidable across her powerful frame, and Oliver stood beside her, not behind, not shielding, simply beside, exactly as he intended to stand for the rest of his life. "By the old custom of my people," Durgash said, her voice carrying clear across the gathered crowd, "when a warrior chooses a mate before witnesses, she marks him, that all who see it will know he is claimed and cherished, and that any who would harm him harm her also." She turned to Oliver and drew from her belt a small curved blade, its edge honed to a wicked gleam, and he felt his pulse quicken, not with fear, but with the same fierce certainty that had carried him through torchlit crowds and rapids cold fear alike. "I have no clan left to witness this properly," she said, quieter now, meant only for him though the whole village could hear it. "I left my warband behind long before I ever set foot on your dock, Oliver Graves, for reasons that are their own story. But I would not have this be secret, or shamed, or hidden away. I want Larkmore to witness what I choose, as plainly as they once condemned me." "Then let them witness," he said, and held out his hand, palm up, steady despite the small blade she held. She drew it, gentle and precise, across his palm, a shallow line, no deeper than a healer's own careful cut, and then drew the same line across her own palm, and pressed their hands together, blood mingling, her amber eyes holding his with an intensity that made the whole watching crowd fade to nothing at all. "I choose you," she said, low and fierce and utterly without doubt. "Not because you are strong in the way warriors are strong, though you have proven braver than half the men I have fought beside. I choose you because you stood between me and a mob with nothing but your own body and your own true words, because you stitch wounds with hands that never shake even when the world around you is chaos, because you looked at me from the very first night, bleeding on your dock, and saw a person worth saving instead of a monster worth fearing. I am Durgash Steele. Oh, and I claim you before every witness gathered here, and I will not be quiet about it. Not ever again." Oliver's throat had gone tight, his eyes stinging with something he did not bother to hide. "I'm no great warrior," he said. "I'm an apothecary who spent his whole life stitching other men's wounds and going home alone to an empty house every night. I never thought a woman like you fearless, magnificent, capable of things I'll never fully understand would look twice at a man like me. But you dove into rapids for a boy who wasn't even yours, and you bled in the hollow vale for a village that had never once been kind to you, and you stood in a burning square and let me stand for you instead of standing alone, because you trusted that I meant it. I choose you too, Durgash Steeljaw. I have chosen you since the night you told me you'd break my neck if I poisoned you, and I have not once looked back since." The crowd around them, the same crowd that had gathered with torches and pitchforks not 2 weeks before, erupted instead into something warmer. Cheers and laughter, and Nan Pell openly weeping into her apron, and Tam pushing to the front to whoop with pure delighted noise, and Reeve Holly's Bayan raising his voice above it all to declare, with the particular gravity of a man who had learned a hard lesson and meant to honor it properly, that Durgash Steele was no longer merely Larkmore's hired guard, but Larkmore's own, welcomed and claimed in turn, with every right and honor the village could offer. Durgash kissed him then in the middle of the flower-strung square, blood still drying on both their joined palms, and Oliver Graves felt, for the first time in a life spent tending to everyone else's wounds and going home each night to quiet, empty rooms, that he was no longer merely necessary to the people around him. He was wanted, chosen, needed by a woman who could have gone anywhere, claimed anyone, and had chosen instead to plant herself firmly at his side and never once look away. They built their life together in the months that followed, not in some distant epilogue but in the plain, vivid present of a lake village slowly, steadily learning to hold two kinds of people in its heart at once. Durgash took on the formal role of Larkmoor's guard captain, training a dozen villagers, Tam among them, eager and fierce despite his young age, in the basics of standing a line, of choosing ground wisely, of the particular courage that came not from fearlessness but from choosing, again and again, what mattered more than one's own safety. Oliver expanded his shop to a proper healing house with Nan Pell's help, and found that Durgash's presence beside him during the difficult work holding a frightened patient still, translating his instructions into the blunt, steady tone that calmed panicking fishermen better than his own gentler voice, ever had made him a better healer than he had been alone. They did not marry in the human fashion, not exactly, though Reeve Bayan offered more than once to perform whatever ceremony they wished before the whole village. Durgash preferred, instead, to renew her claim on him each season in the old way of her people, a fresh line drawn light across their palms at the turning of autumn into winter, at winter into spring, a private ritual that had become, over time, a small and cherished tradition the whole village had come to recognize and honor rather than fear. On the anniversary of the day she had dove into the widow's rapids, Larkmoor held a small gathering at the river's edge, not to relive the fear of that day, but to celebrate the boy who had lived because of it, now a full year older and considerably more cautious around fast water, and the woman who had proven, in that single reckless, magnificent act, exactly what kind of heart she carried beneath all that fearsome strength. "You still think I was reckless," Durgash said to him, standing at the river's edge with her arm looped easily around his waist, watching Tam show off his fishing knots to a gaggle of admiring younger children nearby. "I think," Oliver said, pulling her closer, feeling the solid warmth of her against his side, the life they had built together humming quiet and certain between them, "that you were exactly as reckless as the moment required, and not one measure more. I think I fell in love with you standing on that riverbank, though it took me weeks to admit it even to myself. And I think," he added, turning to press a slow, lingering kiss to her mouth in full view of the whole gathered village, no torches burning now, only warm autumn sunlight and the easy laughter of people who had learned, finally, to see her clearly, "that I would not trade a single reckless, magnificent thing about you for all the caution in the world." "Good," Durgash Steeljaw murmured against his lips, amber eyes bright with a fierce and settled joy. "Because I do not intend to change, Oliver Graves. Not for you, not for this village, not for anyone. I intend only to keep choosing you, exactly as reckless and exactly as devoted as I am, for every season we have left." And there, at the edge of the widow's rapids where it had all truly begun, with the whole village that had once feared her now gathered easy and warm around them both, Oliver Graves understood at last that he had stopped being the lonely healer who went home each night to empty rooms, and had become instead something he had never quite dared to hope for. A man chosen, wanted, and fiercely, unshakably loved, by a woman who could have gone anywhere in the world and had decided without hesitation that this small lake village, and this one quiet, steady man were exactly where she belonged.